There is a chapter of American history that has largely been forgotten. A brutal war that has not made its way into most of our history books. Something that happened less than 25 years ago, but of which most young Americans have never even heard of. And something which has deep ramifications for both China and the United States to this very day. Today, we're going on a journey to the year that brought us classic hits like The Matrix and The Phantom Menace, and the time when cell phones were just beginning to really catch on. A time that, for many, brings to mind nostalgic memories. But for others, it brings to mind memories like these.
For many throughout the region, the scars of the war of the 1990s are still raw. The memories of lost loved ones are still fresh, whose lives were lost during the wars of the 90s as a result of the NATO air campaign in terms of responsibility.
In 2016, the United States issued a formal apology for what took place here. But was that enough? And why did the United States feel the need to apologize in the first place? If you understand the answer to that question, you'll understand more about Chinese-American relations than the majority of people alive today. And you'll see why many expert political analysts point to this single incident as one of the greatest turning points in the development of the modern world, with a trail of cause and effect that leads from the streets of Southern Europe to the hidden taxes you pay for your iPhone, to the buildup of China's nuclear arsenal, to the shores of modern-day Taiwan. Today, we're talking about the Kosovo War. As you'll see in today's episode, despite our unprecedented interconnectivity, our world still has an information problem. Depending on where you're located on the globe, the media and narratives that are put in front of you might be completely different from what might be seen by someone living in a different country. Many websites can only be accessed by people local to specific regions, and many streaming services, like Netflix and Disney Plus, have different libraries of content depending on where you're located, with many countries missing out on potentially thousands of different shows and movies based on what's available in their region. To make this episode possible, we're pleased to partner with Private Internet Access, a VPN that helps you encrypt your internet connection and allows you to easily change your IP address to one located in over 84 different countries, giving you access to websites and services that are only available in those locations. This encryption will also help to protect you from the prying eyes of hackers, internet service providers, and others who might try to steal your personal data. Watching streaming services without private internet access is like paying for a 3-course meal, but only being allowed to eat from the kids menu. And who wants to do that? Since Private Internet Access is the sponsor of today's video, I'm pleased to share that our viewers can now grab an 83% discount by using the link in the description. This single subscription can be used with an unlimited amount of devices at the same time, and comes with a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee. So check out the link right now to unlock your media libraries and internet browsing. Now, back to the Kosovo War. In the late 1990s, Southern Europe was in chaos. Yugoslavia was cracking at the seams, a former communist empire that was now rapidly splintering into several independent nations through a series of civil wars. One of those civil wars, a regional dispute, involved Serbia and Kosovo, but would quickly grow into an international conflict involving both China and the United States, who each dutifully took a side in what many have come to call a forgotten proxy war between the clashing forces of communism and democracy. A proxy war complete with its fair share of lies, deceit, stealth bombers, uranium deposits, and a whole lot more. Let's start in 1995, when a group that called itself the Kosovo Liberation Army, or KLA for short, began a series of attacks against Serbian law enforcement officers stationed in the area, with the goal of breaking the region of Kosovo free from Serbian hands and uniting it with Albania. To fuel their campaign, the KLA began to sabotage and loot weapons from Serbian police stations and army posts, while also acquiring a large amount of arms via the black market from Albania. As arms continued to flow in, the region became increasingly nervous of an escalation, and in 1998, that escalation began. The KLA launched an armed uprising against Yugoslav authorities in Kosovo, leading the Serbians to brand them as terrorists. It wouldn't be long before they sought retribution. But when it came, the retribution was not just aimed at those who had actively participated in the rebellion, but against everyone the Serbian forces merely suspected of supporting the KLA, which seemed to become a code phrase for punishing everyone of ethnic Albanian descent in the region, without having to provide proof of insurgency or a fair trial, similar to the criteria Nazi Germany used to expel Jews from their territory half a century earlier. Almost overnight, the Yugoslav army initiated a massive campaign of repression and expulsion of Kosovar Albanians, killing somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 civilians and KLA combatants, and displacing hundreds of thousands of them. It was at this point that NATO decided to intervene.
My fellow Americans, the demands of an outraged and united international community have been met. And there may well be casualties. I ask you to be proud of your country. We will finish the job. For a safer world, for our democratic values, and for a stronger America.
The official goal of their intervention was simple: to cripple the Serbian-led Yugoslav military with airstrikes, so that it would agree to NATO's terms and leave the ethnic Albanians alone. To make all that happen, US stealth bombers were brought in to do the heavy lifting, targeting strategic facilities in Yugoslavia like military installations, bridges, and industrial plants.
We will provide no support for the reconstruction of Serbia.
The intervention drew large support from the population of NATO member nations, not necessarily because all of them were supportive of the rebels, but because they felt the Serbian military had overstepped in its retaliation. The problem is, according to the critics, NATO's response then became an overstep in and of itself. The recipients of these special deliveries from the US Air Force often turned out to be different than expected. As American B-2 stealth bombers descended on Yugoslavia, they began to rack up a serious rap sheet of collateral damage. Among the destruction was included 300 schools and libraries, 20 hospitals, and at least 40,000 damaged civilian houses, as well as other civilian targets like private businesses, cultural monuments, and even nursing homes, with one US stealth bomber killing 21 elderly civilians in a single bombing. And what was most concerning about this was the apparent statistical impossibility of all these separate incidents being accidents. think of bombers during World War II, civilian casualties would be, unfortunately, more understandable, and even expected. Sometimes, even intentional, since World War II bombers often worked by indiscriminately hitting relatively large areas around their actual targets in what was known as area bombardment. But that's not supposed to be the case with the B-2 stealth bomber, which was built for a new era of modern warfare, and was specifically designed for precision attacks to avoid the kind of accidental casualties we saw in the first two world wars. B-2s are equipped with bombs that are guided by lasers and GPS to hit specific targets that have been identified and verified beforehand by a combination of satellites and state-of-the-art, highly scrutinized targeting maps, which include specific notations for off-limits and inappropriate targets. It's a system of checks, double checks, triple checks, and high precision. In fact, the B-2 is not only capable of consistently hitting a specific structure if it so desires, but is even capable of limiting its destruction to a specific part of a specific structure, with specially designed, high-penetration, low-blast munitions. To put it bluntly, B-2 bombers just don't miss, and even if they did miss under rare circumstances, they definitely shouldn't miss so often as to accidentally damage over 40,000 civilian structures in just one conflict, unless they're simply being negligent, aren't being armed with the correct low collateral munitions, or simply don't care about collateral damage as much as the Air Force tells the press they do. Let's give a few more examples that support that thought process. One of the most controversial incidents of the Kosovo War involved NATO accidentally bombing a column of refugees after mistaking them for a military convoy, killing over 60 of them. Ironically, these were the same Albanian refugees NATO said it was in the region to protect in the first place, and the military convoy line simply didn't add up. In this case, the targets were riding in civilian-grade vehicles, including open vehicles, like farm tractors, making it almost impossible to mistake them for a military unit. The very best case scenario is that the pilot pulled the trigger before he clearly identified the target, which you just don't do in regions full of civilians. Or the pilot may have made the decision to bomb the column based on the presence of just a few military vehicles, which might sound justifiable at first, until you realize that it was widely known that military units in the region were being used to escort civilians, for understandable reasons. In another incident, a US airstrike on a railway bridge hit a passenger train and killed at least 10 people, something which could have been easily avoided if the Air Force had bothered to take the simple step of checking the railway's timetable to ensure that there were no civilians in the area when the bridge was struck. In the best case scenario, NATO simply didn't care enough to check. Even worse, on another occasion, 2 separate NATO aircraft bombed a crowded bridge in the middle of the day on a Sunday afternoon, right after a nearby church service had concluded, and several people were walking home across the bridge. Despite the clear presence of civilians, not one, but both aircraft decided to continue with the mission. 17 people were killed, and 10 more were injured. Based on later investigations, the military purpose of targeting this bridge is still unclear. But even assuming it was a valid military target, NATO could have, and should have, chosen to attack at night. Or at least not right after church got out, if they were really serious about avoiding collateral damage. In all of these instances, NATO had the ability to completely avoid the civilian targets if they had simply been more careful. But there were also several instances where even negligence was not a sufficient explanation for what took place. Take, for example, April 23, 1999, the day NATO bombed a TV broadcast station accused of spreading propaganda. The attack ended up killing 16 civilian workers, the equivalent of if someone were at war with America and decided to bomb Fox News or CNN, or even the creators of this YouTube channel, instead of the military. In this instance, NATO did not even try to hide their tracks. They admitted to the bombing under the pretense that the propaganda machine was a legitimate target, making it clear, in no uncertain terms, that NATO was willing to intentionally target civilians if it felt the ends justified that decision. This incident in particular drew considerable public outrage from both sides of the conflict. People begin to get suspicious when countries send stealth bombers to attack sources of alternative information, rather than proving that information wrong with facts and well-reasoned arguments. As is normally the case, this attempt to suppress information, for better or worse, just made many people all the more interested in what exactly it was that NATO was trying to suppress, fueling the flame of doubt and suspicion rather than quenching it. Taken on their own, each of these incidents might be written off as tragic examples of the reality of the fog of war, but taken together, things begin to look bad. There was large support in NATO for the bombing of Yugoslavia when it was understood that the goal was to strike strategic military targets who were guilty of genocide. But nobody thought they were signing up to bomb civilians. And as the civilian death toll began to rise, the motives of the entire operation began to be called into question. Why were we bombing these people in the first place? How could we say that we had entered the war as peacekeepers when we were causing just as much suffering as those we had labeled as terrorists? Even if it did have the best of intentions going into the conflict, NATO sullied them by being very, very sloppy. And that sloppiness was perhaps never more clear than on the fateful night of May 7th, 1999, a night that nearly 25 years later is still not taught in the vast majority of American schools. That night, on a mission that was officially supposed to be targeting a supply depot in Belgrade, a US stealth bomber instead dropped a precision payload of 3 separate JDAM bombs on the local Chinese embassy. According to the US Department of State, an attack on an embassy is considered an attack on the country it represents. It can therefore be concluded that any attack on a foreign embassy should be considered an act of war, something so extreme that even accidents are not to be tolerated. China, apparently, felt the same way. And as the only party other than the United States with actual first-hand access to the data behind what had happened, they had too many unanswered questions to give the US the benefit of the doubt. Their retaliation came swiftly. Almost immediately, the US Embassy in Beijing was surrounded by a crowd of tens of thousands of rioters, who effectively imprisoned the US ambassador inside of the building. For several days, he remained trapped there, as protesters threw rocks, eggs, tomatoes, and even gasoline bombs into the embassy, chanting vows of vengeance against the United States and its NATO allies. When they finally got back in touch with the US ambassador, Chinese officials then demanded something that scared him senseless: an official and open apology. This was a loaded request, one through which China was making a very clear statement. The problem was, officially, the United States had already apologized. President Clinton himself had even already gone on camera in front of reporters to admit responsibility for the bombing, and notably, to say that the attack was a terrible accident. But that's not what China was asking for. When they asked for an apology, they weren't asking for an apology for an accident. They were asking for an apology for an attack. They saw this as an orchestrated plot of subversion, one that many Chinese commentators have since said has put the United States and China on an unavoidable path towards a future war, despite the fact that US commentators usually don't even know that this event ever took place. Officially, the United States claimed that the embassy had been accidentally targeted due to the use of outdated maps. But that raises some questions. How does an outdated map just happen to make a Chinese embassy show up where a supply depot is supposed to be? The short answer is, it doesn't. And that's not how maps work. And the Chinese knew it. But even if this mapping accident did happen, it still doesn't explain the incident. Because as it turns out, Inside sources have since revealed that NATO had previously located and pinpointed the electronic profile of the Chinese embassy, had specifically put it on a no-hit map, and had even specifically put its coordinates into the NATO computer, for the simple reason that the embassy was a banned target, one where NATO had taken special efforts to ensure that no accidental strikes would take place. But special efforts to prevent accidental strikes only work if the strike is actually an accident. They don't work when someone in the command structure tells you to ignore the flagged coordinates and proceed with the mission anyways. In this case, the flag would have to have been seen by not just one person, or even two, but several. Because this target was confirmed and signed off on by members of the Joint Staff, the US European Command, and NATO. What's more, since its coordinates specifically flagged it as a banned target, it would have needed approval from US President Bill Clinton himself in order to authorize the strike. These men all either saw the coordinates specifically flagged as a Chinese embassy and chose to proceed with the attack anyways, or were simply signing off on every target given to them without actually checking anything, giving them the appearance, but not the reality, of a fail-safe system. And because the alternative would mean having to admit they struck the embassy on purpose, the US government actually admitted to this. In a statement by Thomas Pickering, the Undersecretary of State, it was admitted that the locations of bombings were not being verified because we assumed generally high confidence in our procedures. In other words, nobody was confirming anything because everybody just trusted the guy before them. Which does make one ask the question, if this is true, how many other targets and how many other wars have resulted in the deaths of innocent people, of which we have never heard, simply because those targets did not result in the publicity that came with the bombing of a Chinese embassy? If procedure was not followed here, it seems a certainty that there are likely thousands upon thousands of other victims elsewhere. But then again, maybe that's not the case. Maybe this in itself was a lie to cover a greater lie. Where this gets even hairier for NATO is when you realize that this particular Chinese embassy had not only been previously identified, but that it had also long been a target of Western intelligence. The same Western intelligence who handed the strike coordinates to the B-2 bomber pilots. In fact, at the time of the incident, The Guardian even posted an article citing at least 4 separate NATO intelligence officers who all confirmed that they knew exactly where the embassy was, and that they had been monitoring it closely. So how does a Chinese embassy that has previously been specifically identified and specifically banned as a target accidentally become the recipient of a high-precision strike from a US stealth bomber? Well, let me introduce you to the CIA. Unlike other targets in Yugoslavia, which were identified by NATO command, the coordinates for this strike had been specifically selected, checked, and double-checked by none other than the United States Central Intelligence Agency, outside of normal NATO protocols. The question is raised once again. Why does a target specifically selected by the CIA outside of normal NATO targeting protocols just happen to end up being the one that accidentally turns out to be a Chinese embassy? This scenario is so unlikely to be an accident that a senior NATO Air Force officer even said that, far from not knowing the target was an embassy, the Americans must have been given the architect's drawings. The idea the NATO officer was alluding to was that the US not only intended to strike the Chinese embassy, but that they intended to strike the specific part of the building that was hit, with so much accuracy that it seemed they had extensive inside information. What's interesting is that the US had long been eyeballing this embassy. The Chinese were suspected of using the embassy to rebroadcast messages for the Yugoslav army, in exchange for receiving parts of a downed F-117 US stealth fighter from the Serbian forces, parts which were being stored in the embassy until they could be safely extracted out of the country. More than that, it was also suspected that the Chinese embassy had special equipment in use monitoring the cruise missile attacks on the region, with the goal of studying them to develop countermeasures for future conflicts. With that in mind, the part of the Chinese embassy that was struck was the specific part of the building that was used for these intelligence operations, rumored to be the largest Chinese collection center in all of Europe, which was well known to the intelligence agency that selected the target. There were even rumors that the 3 journalists who died may actually have been well-known undercover Chinese intelligence officers, which is quite the coincidence. These details caused one intelligence expert to comment that if it was the wrong building, why did they use the most precise weapons on Earth to hit the right end of that wrong building? The answer is that maybe the temporary international embarrassment seemed worth the cost of protecting the secrets behind stealth fighter technology and maintaining the US lead in cruise missile development. But even if all of this was just coincidence, you can bet that the Chinese assumed the worst. And no one can really blame them, which is why, even today, this incident still has a major effect on US and Chinese relations. Probably bigger than you think, actually. To understand China's mindset throughout this whole incident, you simply need to understand ancient Chinese literature. There is a story from the ancient Warring States period of China, the same period that produced Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War, which all Chinese generals are required to study. One day, a supposedly friendly ruler was meeting another ruler at their mutual border. The meeting went well, until one ruler asked the other about the size of the cauldrons in his royal palace. Understand that in Chinese tradition, every time a dynasty fell, the cauldrons were moved from the existing royal palace into the palace of the conqueror to show divine favor towards the new ruler. By asking the size of his enemy's cauldrons, or, in other words, asking how much effort he would need to make to move them, this ruler was making a subtle comment about his intentions to start a war and take them from him, to measure the weight and strength of his opponent's response to confrontation. Because of this story, China is always looking for occasions where their enemies ask them the size of their cauldrons, or, in other words, provoke them with small threats to measure the size of their international response. In China's mind, when the United States bombed their embassy, it was a specifically designed and controlled experiment to see how China would respond, with the US being able to hide its actions from the rest of the world behind the chaos of the ongoing war in Yugoslavia. Some have even speculated that many of the other civilian casualties in Yugoslavia were targeted intentionally, merely to provide better cover for the United States when it attacked the embassy. After all, if the embassy was the only accidental target, that would have looked infinitely more suspicious than it already did. The embassy incident froze relations between China and NATO for years. It's part of the reason we look at each other with so much distrust, why we spend hundreds of billions of dollars each year on military equipment to protect ourselves from each other, and why we pay higher tariffs on goods coming from China. So why don't more Americans know about the Kosovo War? No matter how you slice it, the incident that took place here was an embarrassment to the United States. And even if it was all just a horrible accident, the question is, would you really want a military coalition armed with the most precise weapons on Earth that still managed to bomb a refugee column, a nursing home, and even an embassy, conducting a peacekeeping operation in your home country? Be sure to subscribe for more episodes on current conflicts and forgotten history. And check out these other videos as well.